I had been waiting for this day with a quiet kind of hope, the kind a father carries when he believes, even after years of distance, that his son will still find a way to honor him. I polished my shoes, straightened my jacket, and told myself that when he offered me his arm, we might bridge something broken between us. The music started, the guests rose, and my heart thudded like it was reaching for a second chance. Have you ever stood in front of family and felt their rejection pierce deeper than any stranger's insult? Tell me honestly, because sometimes it's those wounds that never leave us. When I turned toward him, toward the son I raised with my own hands, his eyes refused to meet mine. His lips moved, but it wasn't kindness. It was refusal, cold, deliberate, final. A silence wrapped around me, heavy and suffocating. I thought my knees might buckle right there, until an unexpected arm appeared at my side, steady and sure. The best man leaned close, and in that moment the whole room held its breath. The best man's arm steadied me, but my legs still felt hollow. I could feel the silence pressing against my ears, heavier than the sound of the organ filling the hall. Everyone was standing, waiting for the walk that should have been simple, but now felt like a trial. I had pictured my son at my side for weeks, almost convinced myself that this would be the moment we both remembered. Instead, I carried the sting of his refusal like a stone in my chest. I didn't look at him, couldn't. If I had, I feared the anger in his eyes would undo me completely. The best man's grip was firm, respectful, and it carried me forward one step at a time. I remember thinking how strange it was, that someone who owed me nothing could give me more than the boy I had raised. As we began to move down the aisle, the clapping started softly, one pair of hands, then another. It grew until the room was filled with a kind of applause that wasn't only for tradition. It sounded like encouragement, like affirmation. For a brief moment, I wondered if the guests were cheering for me or against my son. Perhaps it didn't matter. What mattered was that I felt my shoulders straighten, my back hold steady, my chin lift. What was meant to humiliate had turned into something else entirely. Even in that applause, though, I could feel the absence of his hand on my arm, the absence of his voice, his pride, his acknowledgement. My son stood just a few steps away, and yet it felt like he had banished me to another world. The clapping reminded me I wasn't invisible, but it didn't erase the wound. When I reached the front, I lowered myself into my chair with care. The best man gave a slight nod before stepping back to his place. I tried to return the gesture, though my throat was tight. I could hear the music continue, the ceremony shifting forward, but my mind stayed locked on the moment behind me. His refusal wasn't just about the aisle. It was years of distance solidified in one word, one gesture. And in that chair, with the sound of vows echoing in the hall, I let myself drift backward in time. I thought of the boy who once reached for my hand when we crossed the street, the child who used to call me his hero when I came home tired from work. I could still feel the way he clung to me during storms, how his laughter filled the house when I spun him around. Those memories didn't vanish just because he had turned away. They lived in me, stubborn and unrelenting. But so did the later years, when his words grew sharp and his eyes turned critical. When nothing I did seemed to be enough. The respect I hoped for never arrived, and instead I was left with silence, sometimes even disdain. Sitting in that hall, I couldn't help but wonder where the shift began. Did I push him too hard when he was young? Did I fail him in some way that I couldn't recognize? Or had he simply grown into a man who no longer saw me as someone worth honoring? The applause from earlier still echoed in my ears, a reminder that dignity can be offered from unexpected places. Yet I couldn't shake the ache that my own son had denied me. For all the respect from strangers, what I wanted was his arm, his acknowledgement, his quiet acceptance. And he had refused, not with hesitation, but with certainty. I sat through the vows trying to quiet my thoughts. The couple spoke with trembling voices, full of hope and promises. Their words were meant to inspire, but they hit me differently. I found myself wondering if promises between parents and children ever truly hold, or if they fade over time, replaced by pride and resentment. Every smile in that room seemed distant, every cheer like a sound from behind glass. The bride and groom glowed, but I felt like I was in shadow. I forced myself to smile, to nod when others looked my way, but inside I was restless, caught between gratitude for the best man's kindness and grief for my son's absence. When the ceremony ended, and guests began to shuffle toward the reception, I stayed seated for a moment longer. I wanted to gather myself, to find the strength not to show how shaken I was. A few people stopped as they passed, patting my shoulder, whispering words like, "Beautiful moment," and "So glad you were here." They meant well, but their kindness also reminded me of what I had lost. Respect from strangers cannot fill the emptiness left by family. I rose slowly, watching my son out of the corner of my eye. He stood surrounded by cousins and friends, laughing as if nothing had happened. If he felt shame, he didn't show it. And perhaps that was what stung the most, that my humiliation hadn't even registered as important to him. To him, it was a small decision. To me, it was everything. As I followed the crowd toward the reception hall, I carried the applause with me, but I also carried the silence. The sound of my son's refusal was louder in my memory than the clapping of 100 guests. Still, I told myself this was not the end of the story. Not for me. There had to be more to uncover, why he had turned against me, why he chose distance over respect, and whether I could ever stop letting his rejection define my worth. The clapping faded as people drifted toward the reception, but I kept replaying the sound of it in my head. For a moment, it had covered the silence between my son and me, but now that moment was gone, and I was left with the quiet weight of his absence. It's strange how quickly the noise of a room can turn into the echo of what you've lost. Walking into the reception hall, the best man stayed close for a few steps. He didn't say much, just a nod, a slight pat on my back. No speeches, no pity, just presence. Sometimes presence is louder than any words. He had no obligation to me, yet he had stepped in where my own son would not. That thought followed me to my seat. I watched as the bride and groom entered, faces lit up by the glow of cameras and cheers. They looked untouched by the undercurrents that pulled at me. For them, this day was joy, promise, new beginnings. For me, it was proof of how far my family had shifted. It's not that I begrudged them their happiness. No, I wanted that for them. But beneath the music and clinking glasses, there was an emptiness at my table. A gap my son had carved by refusing me. I tried to keep my face neutral, tried to eat the meal in front of me, but every bite felt like effort. My eyes kept wandering to my son across the room. He laughed, his shoulders shaking, his glass lifted high when someone made a toast. To anyone watching, he was the picture of ease, a man at peace in celebration. But I couldn't help seeing the cracks, or maybe just the ones I wanted to believe were there. Did he really feel so comfortable while I sat alone? Did he not notice? Or had he decided long ago that my dignity wasn't his concern? The best man joined the couple at their table, yet now and then I caught him glancing in my direction. A small nod, a look that seemed to say he hadn't forgotten. That, oddly, steadied me more than my son's laughter. Sometimes respect comes from where you least expect it, and that truth both comforted and wounded me at once. As the evening went on, I found myself remembering other gatherings. Family dinners when my wife was still alive, when the table was full of arguments and teasing, but always ended in her soft insistence that we eat dessert together. Back then, my son sat close, his head bent as he listened to my stories. He used to look at me as though I had the answers. Now, he didn't even look at me at all. I wondered when the shift had hardened into distance. Was it the years I spent buried in work, coming home too tired to talk? Or was it later when I tried to give advice he didn't want to hear? Fathers are often too late in noticing when they stop being needed. I thought I was guiding him. Maybe he thought I was only criticizing. The clatter of plates pulled me back into the present. A cousin leaned over and asked how I was doing, her voice soft with concern. I smiled, told her I was fine, and she seemed satisfied. But that's the curse of age. People ask, but they rarely want the whole truth. They don't want to hear about loneliness at a family table, or the way a son's rejection cuts deeper than any insult from a stranger. Music rose and people began to dance. I stayed seated, my hands folded over my glass. I told myself I was tired, but the truth was simpler. I didn't want to stand there and pretend. Pretending has a cost, and I had already paid too much for appearances in my life. The best man came over once more before the night ended. He sat down beside me without invitation, as though he understood that silence could be shared. After a long pause, he said, "You carried yourself with pride today. Don't forget that. It wasn't much, but it reached me." He had seen the humiliation, but he had also seen the strength. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been burning in me all night. "Did you see his face when he refused?" The best man looked at me, then away, as if weighing what to say. Finally, he answered, "I saw it, and I saw yours. That's why I stepped in." That truth stayed with me. He had acted not out of pity, but out of recognition. Recognition of the dignity I was about to lose if no one helped. He didn't replace my son, but he gave me something my son would not, respect. And that act, small as it was, reminded me that I wasn't finished. My worth wasn't entirely in my son's hands, even if it felt that way tonight. When the night ended, and I walked out into the cool air, I thought about what the applause had meant, what the best man's arm had given me. These moments were more than gestures, they were symbols. Symbols that even when family fails, strangers can see you. And maybe that was the beginning of something I hadn't expected. A reminder that my life wasn't over just because my son had turned away. Yet even as I felt that spark, there was a question gnawing at me. Why? Why had my son refused? Until I faced that, applause and kind gestures would never be enough. The ride home from the wedding felt longer than it should have. Streetlights blurred past the car window, but I hardly noticed them. All I could think about was the way my son looked through me, as though I was a stranger. The refusal had cut me once, but the silence afterward was a second wound. Slower, more deliberate. Nights like these never end when you close your eyes. They follow you inside, sit heavy on your chest, and whisper questions you can't silence. I told myself I would sleep, but instead I sat in my chair, staring at the shadows on the wall, asking the same thing over and over. What did I do to earn that refusal? It's a dangerous question because it digs back through years, pulling up every moment you might have misstepped. I thought of arguments when he was a teenager, of lectures that stretched too long, of my stubborn refusal to apologize when I should have. I thought of times I didn't show up to his games, choosing overtime at work instead. A father's memory can become a courtroom, and I was both the witness and the accused. The next morning I decided not to bury it. I had to know. Pretending would rot me from the inside. So I called him. The phone rang too long before he picked up. His voice clipped, as if I'd interrupted something important. Maybe I had. Maybe that was the story of us. Me always arriving at the wrong time. "I want to talk," I said. "About what?" His voice had no warmth, only obligation. "About last night." Silence stretched between us. I could almost hear him weighing whether to hang up or to give me the courtesy of a few words. Finally, he said, "I don't think there's much to say." That sentence landed harder than his refusal at the aisle. Because in it was the truth. He had already decided my role in his life was finished. But I pressed. "There's always something to say. Even if it's ugly, I'd rather know than sit here wondering." Another pause, then a sigh. "Fine. Come by the house later. We'll talk." The hours until evening crawled. I tried to distract myself. Wash dishes, read the paper, even stepped out for a walk. But everything circled back to that meeting. When I finally stood at his door, I realized how much my hands shook. Not from age, not from weakness, but from the fear of what I was about to hear. He opened the door but didn't invite me in with a smile. Instead, he stepped aside, eyes flat. His house smelled of new paint, new furniture, a life built without me in mind. We sat across from each other in his living room. He didn't offer coffee or water. He just folded his arms and waited. "You didn't want to walk with me?" I said quietly. "Tell me why." His jaw tightened. Because it wasn't about you. It was her day. And honestly, I didn't want you making it about you. That stung, sharper than I expected. Making it about me? I only wanted to stand beside my son. Dad, he said, leaning forward. Do you even realize how often you've done that? Made things about you? At my graduation, you gave a speech so long I didn't even get to talk to half my friends. At Mom's funeral, you decided everything. Music, readings, all of it, without asking me what I thought. You've always taken the front seat, even when you didn't belong there. His words fell like stones. Part of me wanted to argue, to defend myself. But another part, the part that had sat awake all night, knew there was truth in what he said. I thought I was doing what was right, I said slowly. I thought I was leading. Leading, he repeated, almost with bitterness. Maybe that's the problem. You never stopped to follow. I looked at him across that room, the man he'd become, and realized that somewhere along the way, my guidance had turned into a weight he resented. What I thought was protection he saw as control. We sat in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "That's why I couldn't let you walk with me. It wasn't disrespect. It was me drawing a line. I wanted to be angry, to rise from the chair and storm out. But the anger didn't come, only sadness. And beneath it, a strange kind of clarity. He wasn't just rejecting me, he was claiming himself. When I left his house, the night air felt heavy, but my steps were steady. The wound was deep, yes, but at least now I had an answer that hurt, but one that also left a door open. Because knowing the truth meant I could decide what to do with it. Leaving my son's house, I felt the weight of the night pressing against me. His words replayed endlessly, like a record stuck on the same painful note. But I realized the confrontation was only half the story. There was the wedding itself and how others had reacted or hadn't. Family gatherings always had a way of amplifying the hidden tensions, and I suddenly wanted to trace every glance, every whisper, to see if someone else had noticed the divide. At breakfast the next morning, my phone buzzed with messages from relatives who had attended. Some were concerned, asking if I was all right. Others offered a quiet sympathy that felt more like distance than compassion. Even within my own extended family, the silence was loud. I remembered the way my niece had hesitated before speaking to me, as if she, too, feared saying the wrong thing. Family loyalty can be complicated, I thought, tangled between protecting someone and staying neutral. I wandered through the house, memories of the wedding flashing in my mind. My daughter-in-law's radiant smile, the decorations carefully chosen, the music that had made the room feel alive. Yet all of it was tinged with a subtle sorrow. My son's absence at my side. Every handshake, every hug I received from distant relatives seemed to remind me of the void between us. The room had clapped when the best man offered his arm, but inside, I clapped too quietly, my joy muted by a gnawing sense of exclusion. Later, I called my sister. Her voice carried warmth, but even she approached the topic with caution. "He didn't mean to hurt you," she said. "He's trying to assert himself, I think. Maybe you could try reaching out again, gently." I wanted to, but reaching out felt like crossing a tightrope over a canyon. One wrong word, one misstep, and the bridge could collapse completely. Still, I felt the need to understand the patterns of our family. Why did my son feel he couldn't walk beside me? Why had I always believed our bond was stronger than it apparently was? I started journaling, hoping that writing might untangle the mess inside my head. I wrote about the wedding, about the hush of the church as I waited for my son, about the weight of the best man's offer and the applause that followed. I wrote about my fears of growing older, of becoming invisible, of losing touch with the son I had raised. And in writing, I noticed patterns I hadn't seen before. The subtle shifts in our family over the years, the moments when my voice had been louder than my listening, the times when I had assumed my way was the only way. The next day, I visited my friend Robert. He had known me long before my son was born and had always offered candid perspective. "You need to see it from his side," he said, as we sat on the worn porch swing. "You were both doing what you thought was right. But maybe it was never about the wedding. Maybe it's about a lifetime of decisions. Some he resented, some he admired. You can't undo the past, but you can learn how to move forward. I nodded, but the knot in my chest remained. Robert's words were both comforting and challenging. They reminded me that relationships aren't fixed objects. They shift, grow, fracture, and heal. I couldn't control my son's decisions, only my own actions in response. That truth was liberating in theory but felt heavy in practice. That evening, I found myself reflecting on the best man. A man I barely knew had stepped into a role I had expected my son to fill. The irony wasn't lost on me. The best man's kindness had illuminated the absence of my son, but it also showed that human decency could fill gaps, even in fractured families. I thought about reaching out to him, not to intrude, but to thank him quietly for that moment. Sometimes, recognition isn't just for grand gestures. It's for the small, meaningful acts that restore a sense of dignity. The days that followed were a blur of reflection and cautious attempts to reconnect. I visited my son again, but this time without expectation. I brought a small notebook, intending to leave it with him. Inside, I wrote my thoughts. No accusations, no demands. Only memories, apologies, and hopes. When I handed it to him, his eyes softened slightly. He didn't speak, but I could see that the act of offering, rather than pressing, made a difference. I realized then that family conflict isn't always resolved with words. Sometimes it's resolved in presence, in gestures, in the willingness to remain open even when hurt runs deep. The past cannot be changed, but the way we move forward can be shaped by patience and respect. I left his house that day feeling lighter, not because the conflict had vanished, but because I had planted a seed for future understanding. At night, I sat alone on the porch again, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood. The world felt quieter, more reflective. I thought about the journey ahead, years of learning to walk beside my son in ways he needed rather than I imagined. And though the path was uncertain, I felt a tentative hope. Perhaps family isn't about perfect moments or expected gestures. Perhaps it's about resilience, persistence, and the willingness to remain connected even when the connection is fragile. The following weekend, I found myself walking through the quiet streets near my son's home. The air smelled faintly of rain and blooming flowers, carrying a sense of renewal that I hadn't noticed before. I realized that I had been carrying my frustration like a heavy coat, worn so long I hardly noticed its weight until I tried to move. As I approached the door, my heart raced, not with expectation, but with cautious curiosity. What would happen if I simply showed up without an agenda, without pushing for apology or explanation? When my son opened the door, I was met with a neutral expression, neither warmth nor hostility. I offered a small smile and he nodded slightly. "Hi," I said softly, almost hesitant. It was a simple word, but it carried the weight of days spent in reflection. He gestured for me to come in, and we sat in the living room, the silence filled with unspoken tension. I wondered whether he felt as awkward as I did, whether he had rehearsed what to say, or whether he simply wanted the moment to pass without confrontation. I decided to speak from the heart, avoiding blame or criticism. "I wanted to bring something for you," I said, reaching into my bag and pulling out the notebook I had filled with reflections, memories, and thoughts about our relationship. His eyes flicked to it briefly, and I felt the slightest easing of the tightness I had carried for weeks. "There's no need to respond right away. I just wanted to share this with you. Maybe it will help you understand what I've felt, and maybe it can help me understand you too." He took the notebook carefully, as if handling a fragile artifact. We didn't speak for several minutes, the quiet stretching between us in a way that felt almost sacred. Finally, he looked up. I'll read this," he said, his voice low but steady. "Thank you for giving it to me." There was no apology, no grand gesture, but I sensed an opening, a crack in the wall that had separated us. It was small but meaningful. After leaving his house, I walked slowly, letting the evening settle around me. I thought about the power of presence, of simply showing up without demanding anything in return. Sometimes, the act of being there, without drama, without insistence, create space for healing that words alone cannot achieve. I felt a tentative hope that perhaps our bond could be rebuilt, step by step, through patience and honest effort. The next morning, I received a text from the best man who had offered his arm at the wedding. It was short, almost casual. I hope everything is okay. I know that day was complicated. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. I smiled, appreciating the unexpected support. People who act out of kindness often leave marks we don't anticipate. His gesture, seemingly small at the time, had shown me that empathy exists even in the most strained situations. It reminded me that family isn't the only place to find understanding. It can come from friends, neighbors, or even strangers who step forward when needed. That afternoon, I visited my sister again. She had noticed a change in me over the past weeks. The shift from frustration to reflection, from hurt to cautious optimism. I can see you're approaching this differently now, she said. You're giving him space but also reaching out. That balance is rare and powerful. I nodded. She reminded me that relationships often require both patience and courage. The patience to wait for someone to respond in their own time, and the courage to take steps even when the outcome is uncertain. I started thinking about the wedding in a new light. It wasn't simply about my son refusing to walk beside me. It was about the larger story of our family, the unspoken tensions, the history of expectations and disappointments. I realized that holding on to resentment would only deepen the divide. If I wanted reconciliation, I needed to continue approaching it with openness and humility. In the days that followed, small gestures became my way of reaching out. I sent messages that weren't intrusive, left thoughtful notes, and occasionally called without expectation of lengthy conversation. Each time I received a response, even a brief one, I felt a small but tangible connection. It wasn't the same as it had been years ago, but it was a start. Sometimes progress isn't dramatic. It's subtle, measured, almost imperceptible, but its effect accumulates over time. One evening, my son surprised me by calling. He hadn't said much at first, just asked how I was doing. Our conversation was careful, polite, and tentative. But beneath the surface, there was a shift, a willingness to communicate without defensiveness. I felt the beginnings of trust returning. It was fragile, and I knew it could be broken again, but it existed, and that was something to hold on to. I reflected on how family conflict often escalates because each person assumes the other's intentions are hostile. Misunderstandings become mountains, and silence turns into walls. But once we allow ourselves to step forward with empathy, even in small increments, those mountains can slowly erode. It doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't erase past hurts, but it creates a pathway for connection. By the end of the week, I had begun noticing other relationships shifting as well. Extended family members who had remained distant started engaging in small acts of communication. My presence, steady and non-demanding, seemed to signal that reconciliation was possible. It made me understand that healing one relationship often ripples outward, influencing the wider network of connections we maintain. That night, I sat alone, thinking about resilience. The wedding had been a test, but not a conclusion. It was a moment that revealed cracks, yes, but also a space for repair. The process of mending isn't linear. It's messy, uneven, and sometimes painful. But each effort to reach out, each willingness to stay present in spite of hurt, strengthens the foundation of a relationship. I understood now that rebuilding trust takes time, but it is always possible if approached with honesty, patience, and respect. And so I continued small steps, quiet reflection, persistent effort. Each day brought new challenges, new emotional waves, but also subtle victories. The gap between my son and me hadn't disappeared, but it had narrowed, just slightly, enough to give me hope that the future might be different from the past. Sometimes, the most meaningful moments in life are not the grand gestures, but the small, deliberate acts that signal love, respect, and a willingness to endure together. The week after our tentative reconnection, I noticed subtle signs that the wounds were still raw, both in me and in him. A call that had once seemed promising now carried a hesitant tone, as if each word was weighed before being spoken. I realized that rebuilding trust was not a linear path. Every small act of outreach could be met with warmth or guarded distance, and I had to prepare myself for both. One afternoon, my phone rang unexpectedly. It was my son, but there was a tension in his voice I hadn't heard before. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked, quickly, almost hurriedly. I sensed urgency, but not anger. Still, my stomach twisted in anticipation. What would this conversation reveal? Would it be another minor breakthrough, or a setback that would reopen old wounds? I sat down, bracing myself to listen, to be patient, and to respond with care. He began hesitantly, avoiding eye contact even over the phone. "I've been thinking about the wedding, about everything that happened that day." His words were cautious, measured, and for the first time I could hear vulnerability beneath the surface. There was no blame, just a quiet acknowledgement of tension, of emotions neither of us had fully expressed before. I responded softly, keeping my tone neutral and warm. "I know it wasn't easy. It was difficult for me too. We're both trying to find our footing again." He paused, then admitted something I hadn't expected. "I felt embarrassed that day. I didn't know how to handle it, and I reacted badly." Hearing him articulate his feelings, owning a fraction of responsibility, was both relieving and bittersweet. It reminded me that even those closest to us can stumble under pressure, that hurt sometimes comes from confusion or fear rather than malice. I reassured him that his feelings were valid and that mistakes didn't define us permanently. Despite this breakthrough, the days that followed were unpredictable. One evening, I invited him over for tea, hoping to continue our tentative connection in person. He hesitated at the door, wringing his hands slightly before stepping inside. We sat across from each other, the table acting as a small barrier between us, but one that seemed manageable. Conversation began cautiously. Topics were mundane, carefully chosen, safe. But gradually the rhythm shifted. Small jokes, shared memories, and moments of silence started bridging the gap that had widened for years. However, reconciliation was never smooth. That same week, I noticed a subtle but noticeable tension with his spouse, who seemed wary of my presence. There were polite smiles, courteous gestures, but an undercurrent of discomfort that reminded me that repairing one relationship does not always resolve all connected dynamics. I had to navigate not only my son's feelings, but also the broader ecosystem of family relationships, each with its own fragility. I understood then that rebuilding trust was like tending a garden. Each plant needed care, but some were more sensitive, and weather patterns, external pressures, could disrupt even the best efforts. Later, a misunderstanding arose when a message I sent was interpreted as criticism. My intention had been supportive, but my son's immediate response carried defensiveness, revealing how easily old patterns could resurface. I recognized the need for patience, the importance of stepping back and allowing him space to process, rather than reacting impulsively. It was a reminder that progress isn't a straight line, and that the past often lingers in subtle ways, influencing how we interpret actions in the present. One evening, I reflected on the nature of family conflict. How often do we assume intention rather than ask for clarification? How often do we let pride and fear dictate our responses, rather than empathy and openness? These questions weighed heavily, not just in theory but in the living reality of my relationship with my son. I realized that each interaction was an opportunity to practice a new way of being, one that honored both our experiences, our vulnerabilities, and our desire for connection. Amidst these small tensions, moments of profound connection emerged. One afternoon, while looking through old family albums together, we laughed at the same memories, shared stories, and discovered mutual perspectives that neither of us had considered before. These moments were fleeting but significant, signaling that beneath the strained surface, there remained a foundation worth nurturing. I felt gratitude for the opportunity to witness these glimpses of understanding, knowing they represented the slow but steady work of rebuilding trust. Despite progress, I couldn't ignore lingering doubts. Would this tentative connection hold in moments of stress or conflict? Would old habits reemerge when patience waned? I grappled with these questions privately, acknowledging the fragility of progress while maintaining hope. I realized that resilience in relationships isn't just about grand gestures. It's about consistently showing up, navigating discomfort, and choosing connection even when it's difficult. A week later, a small incident tested the new dynamic we had established. A forgotten commitment, a miscommunication, and suddenly tension resurfaced. I felt my chest tighten, the familiar ache of disappointment creeping in. But instead of reacting with frustration, I paused. I reminded myself of the small victories, the tentative steps forward, and the shared willingness to continue. When my son and I addressed the miscommunication calmly, the outcome was constructive. The incident reinforced the idea that resilience isn't the absence of conflict. It's the ability to navigate it with care and understanding. Through these experiences, I began to notice subtle shifts in myself as well. I approached conversations with curiosity rather than judgment, with patience rather than expectation. I learned to accept partial progress, to celebrate small wins, and to remain present even when outcomes were uncertain. Each moment of connection, no matter how minor, reinforced the importance of persistence and empathy in healing fractured bonds. By the end of the week, I realized that reconciliation is ongoing. It requires attention, care, and emotional stamina. The path is never smooth, and setbacks are inevitable. But the key lies in showing up, maintaining openness, and cultivating trust gradually. I felt a sense of cautious optimism, knowing that the journey wasn't over, but that meaningful progress had been made. The lessons of the past few weeks had transformed the way I viewed family relationships. I understood that forgiveness, patience, and vulnerability were not signs of weakness. They were acts of courage. By confronting discomfort, engaging in honest communication, and allowing space for mistakes, I had begun to lay the foundation for a bond that could endure beyond the immediate challenges of the past. As I prepared for the weekend, planning another visit with my son, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead remained uncertain, but the emotional connection we were rebuilding, fragile as it was, offered hope. I knew that reconciliation is a living process, one that requires constant attention and care, and I was willing to continue walking it, step by step, alongside him, ready to navigate whatever challenges might arise next. The weekend arrived with a mix of anticipation and quiet anxiety. I had spent days carefully planning our time together, wanting it to feel light, comforting, and unforced. Yet, the moment my son stepped through the door, I could sense an invisible tension lingering in the air. It was subtle, the kind you only notice when silence stretches longer than usual, when gestures feel cautious rather than spontaneous. Despite our small victories in conversation over the past weeks, it was clear that the fragile trust between us could be disrupted by the smallest of missteps. We sat down in the living room, cups of tea warming our hands. I tried to ease into familiar topics, those that had previously sparked laughter and shared memories. But before long, an unexpected comment from his spouse pulled the conversation in a new direction. "I think sometimes we're too quick to assume everything is resolved," she said, almost in passing, her tone measured yet pointed. I felt a ripple of unease. This subtle reminder underscored the reality that healing is never isolated. It exists within a broader web of relationships, each with its own unspoken tensions. My son's reaction was telling. He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, and for a brief moment, I caught a flash of defensiveness. It reminded me how easily old patterns could resurface. The wedding incident, though distant in time, still cast shadows over our interactions. The momentary calm we had cultivated was fragile, and external pressures could disrupt it in an instant. I reminded myself to breathe, to listen, and to resist the urge to react immediately. Later, while we were reviewing some old family photographs, a particularly evocative image triggered memories of the past, both joyful and painful. I shared a story connected to the photo, hoping it might bridge the gap between us. My son responded with a soft chuckle, a small but meaningful sign of engagement. Yet even in these moments of connection, I could sense the undercurrent of unresolved conflict. His voice carried a hesitancy that suggested both desire and fear, a tension between wanting to reconcile and guarding against potential hurt. The following day brought another subtle test of our bond. My son received a call that drew him away unexpectedly, leaving me to wait in silence. I used the time to reflect on our progress, acknowledging that even small disruptions could evoke old anxieties. I thought about how often family conflict is fueled not just by overt disagreements but by unspoken expectations, misunderstandings, and moments of insecurity. Rebuilding trust required patience, attentiveness, and the willingness to navigate these nuances without judgment. That evening, he returned, and we attempted to pick up where we left off. But tension lingered, manifesting in brief pauses, tentative responses, and careful phrasing. I realized then that reconciliation is not a single event but a series of small, deliberate choices. Each interaction offered a chance to affirm connection or, inadvertently, to reopen wounds. The responsibility weighed on me, but I also felt a sense of empowerment in knowing that my presence and patience could make a difference. During our conversation, an unexpected revelation emerged. He admitted that he had harbored feelings of resentment toward me, not fully recognizing them until recently. His words were tentative but honest. "I think I was angry at you for things I didn't understand at the time." Hearing him articulate this brought a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief, because acknowledgement was the first step toward healing. Sorrow, because it reminded me of the unspoken pain that had accumulated over the years. I offered reassurance, validating his feelings and emphasizing that our relationship was a living process, one that could evolve with time and effort. The evening concluded with a quiet moment of reflection. I watched him leave for the night, feeling a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Our progress was real but precarious, and the external influences, the subtle judgments of family, the weight of past grievances, remained factors we had to navigate carefully. I realized that while personal reconciliation is vital, the broader context of family dynamics can either support or undermine it. The challenge was not just rebuilding trust with my son but fostering an environment where that trust could thrive. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes in both of us. We began to communicate more openly, sharing memories, frustrations, and small victories. Yet, each moment of progress was tempered by awareness that setbacks were always possible. I reflected on the nature of resilience. It's not the absence of conflict, but the ability to engage with it constructively. Every conversation, every interaction, became an opportunity to practice patience, empathy, and emotional honesty. A minor miscommunication during one of our outings reminded me that vigilance was still necessary. A comment I made was misinterpreted, leading to a brief withdrawal on his part. I resisted the urge to defend myself immediately, choosing instead to allow space for reflection and follow-up dialogue. Later, when we addressed the misunderstanding calmly, the result was a reaffirmation of progress rather than a regression. These small victories reinforced the idea that trust is rebuilt incrementally, through consistent, mindful effort. By the end of the week, I felt a renewed sense of cautious optimism. The bond between my son and me, though still fragile, had begun to demonstrate resilience. I understood that reconciliation is a dynamic process, requiring patience, humility, and persistence. External pressures would continue to test us, but each challenge also offered an opportunity to strengthen our connection, to practice forgiveness, and to embrace vulnerability as a pathway to deeper understanding. I concluded my reflections with gratitude for the small yet significant moments that punctuated our week. Each laugh, each candid conversation, each pause of understanding contributed to a growing foundation of trust. I recognized that the road ahead would be neither smooth nor predictable, but the steps we had taken thus far had set the stage for continued growth and healing. And in that awareness, I found a sense of hope that sustained me through the uncertainties yet to come. The following week, I felt an uneasy anticipation settling in, as though the fragile trust my son and I had been rebuilding could be tested at any moment. I found myself watching for subtle cues in his tone, his gestures, even the way he lingered near the doorway before leaving for work. Our tentative reconciliation, though meaningful, had not yet weathered the full spectrum of our family's scrutiny. The wedding incident still hovered like a shadow, and I was acutely aware that unresolved emotions could surface without warning. One afternoon, while I was sorting through old letters, I stumbled upon an envelope I had not seen in years. Its edges were worn, the ink slightly faded, but the handwriting immediately caught my attention. I hesitated for a moment, knowing that opening it could unearth memories I had long buried. Still, something compelled me to read its contents. The letter was from my late father, addressed to me with a mixture of guidance, regret, and cautious hope. He wrote about the importance of family bonds, acknowledging the imperfections in our relationships, and urging me to hold on to patience and understanding. The words struck a chord, stirring a blend of sorrow and clarity that I had not anticipated. As I pondered the letter's message, my son entered the room unexpectedly. His eyes met mine, carrying a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. I decided to share the letter with him, sensing that it might serve as a bridge between us, a reminder that the struggles we faced were not unique, but part of a larger tapestry of family history. I read it aloud, carefully emphasizing the passages about patience, forgiveness, and enduring love. For a long moment, we sat in silence, absorbing the weight of those words together. Then came the revelation I had not foreseen. My son hesitated, then spoke quietly, almost reluctantly, confessing something that had been hidden for years. "I never told you this before, but I've carried some of the blame for what happened with the wedding," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The confession hung in the air, fragile and tentative, yet it shifted the dynamic in ways that neither of us could have predicted. I felt a mixture of surprise and relief. Surprise at the timing and depth of his admission. Relief that he was willing to confront his own feelings rather than deflect them. The conversation deepened as he revealed the internal struggle he had faced, caught between resentment and guilt, pride and vulnerability. I listened without interruption, allowing him to articulate the complexity of his emotions. In that moment, I realized that the real reconciliation required more than apologies. It demanded honesty, courage, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Our connection, fragile as it was, became stronger through this shared vulnerability. Yet, even amid this breakthrough, challenges emerged. He admitted that other family members had influenced his perspective, sometimes unintentionally reinforcing misunderstandings or biases. These external pressures highlighted the fragility of our progress and underscored the need for vigilance in nurturing trust. I recognize that while personal reconciliation is essential, it cannot exist in isolation. It must withstand the ripple effects of family dynamics and external expectations. Later that evening, we took a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to let the tension ease into quiet reflection. The night air was crisp, carrying a hint of autumn, and the soft glow of streetlights painted familiar paths in a new light. We spoke about shared memories from my youth, his childhood, and the moments that had shaped our family. Each story, each recollection, carried both joy and subtle lessons, reminding us of the layers of complexity that define our relationships. During our walk, I noticed a subtle change in his demeanor. He seemed more open, more willing to express emotions he had previously concealed. There was a tentative warmth in his gestures, a cautious lightness in his laughter. It was as if acknowledging past mistakes and articulating hidden feelings had created a small space for authenticity to flourish. I felt a cautious hope that this moment might represent a turning point in our relationship, a step toward genuine understanding and connection. Returning home, we continued our conversation over a simple dinner. The exchange was grounded in honesty rather than forced civility. I noticed that our dialogue, once punctuated by hesitation and guarded statements, had transformed into an evolving conversation marked by curiosity, empathy, and mutual respect. Even in the presence of lingering tension, there was a sense of forward motion, a recognition that our bond could be nurtured with intention and care. By the time he left for the evening, I reflected on the day with a quiet gratitude. The letter from my father had served as both a catalyst and a compass, guiding us through the delicate terrain of reconciliation. My son's admission had illuminated the complexities of his emotions, allowing me to see the depth of his struggle and the sincerity of his intentions. It was clear that the journey ahead would remain intricate and unpredictable, but we had taken a critical step toward aligning our hearts and intentions. Before retiring for the night, I revisited the letter once more. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, understanding that the efforts to rebuild trust and connection were ongoing, requiring patience, reflection, and the courage to confront both past and present challenges. The day had offered a profound lesson. Reconciliation is neither instantaneous nor linear. It is a living process, marked by moments of insight, confession, and delicate negotiation, all of which shape the evolving narrative of family bonds. As I closed the envelope and set it aside, I understood that while we could not rewrite the past, we could influence the present and future with conscious choices, honesty, and vulnerability. The revelation from my son, coupled with the wisdom of my father, had created a fertile ground for transformation, a space where trust could be restored and emotional wounds could begin to heal. The journey was far from over, but the direction was clearer, and the path forward, though tentative, held promise. After the revelations between my son and me, I thought there might be a quiet calm settling over our family, but life rarely unfolds in such straightforward ways. A few days later, an unexpected tension arose when relatives began commenting on the wedding incident. Small remarks at casual gatherings, framed as jokes or casual observations, carried undercurrents that immediately set my nerves on edge. I noticed my son's subtle stiffening each time the topic came up, a reminder that even honest confessions cannot erase the weight of perception or lingering resentment. That evening, I invited him to sit down with me in the living room, hoping to address the unease before it could fester. The room felt heavy, the soft hum of the overhead light amplifying the silence between us. I wanted him to understand that despite the confrontation at the wedding, our connection mattered more than the opinions of others. He shifted in his chair, hesitant, yet willing to engage. We started cautiously, discussing the underlying emotions behind each remark, unpacking the subtle dynamics that had shaped his reluctance at the ceremony. He spoke about feeling invisible at times, caught between expectations and his own discomfort. His words revealed the invisible pressures we often overlook, how family dynamics can subtly shape behavior, even when intentions are pure. I listened, trying to absorb both the content of his words and the vulnerability beneath them. There was an honesty in his tone that had been absent for years, a rawness that reminded me of the importance of acknowledging every emotion, however uncomfortable. As we navigated the conversation, I noticed a lingering shadow over his expressions, a mixture of guilt and frustration. He admitted that part of his hesitation to escort me was tied to long-standing misunderstandings and miscommunications that had compounded over the years. He hadn't intended to hurt me, but the cumulative effect of these feelings had manifested in that fateful moment at the wedding. I felt a pang of sorrow, recognizing that sometimes our closest relationships are complicated by patterns we fail to notice until they emerge in moments of crisis. I decided to share some of my own past insecurities, moments when I had failed to understand his perspective. Speaking openly about my regrets created a subtle shift. The tension in the room seemed to relax, if only slightly. We began to see each other not just as parent and child, but as two individuals shaped by our experiences, capable of misunderstanding yet capable of growth. The dialogue was tentative, reflective, and occasionally punctuated by awkward silences, yet it felt authentic in a way that previous attempts at conversation had not. Later that week, a family gathering brought the issue to the forefront once again. The room was buzzing with laughter and chatter, but beneath it, the undercurrents of prior events lingered. Someone made a passing comment about weddings and responsibilities, unintentionally triggering a flash of discomfort in both my son and me. I caught his eye, noticing a fleeting mix of anxiety and resolve. This moment crystallized the delicate balance we were trying to maintain, acknowledging past pain while moving toward understanding. After the gathering, we walked home in silence, each step punctuated by the soft rhythm of our thoughts. I felt a quiet determination to continue nurturing this fragile trust, recognizing that reconciliation is not a single event but a series of small, intentional acts. He finally spoke, breaking the silence with a tentative question about whether past grievances could ever truly disappear or if they would always linger in subtle ways. I considered my response carefully, emphasizing that while some memories remain, how we choose to engage with them shapes our present and future. That night, I reflected on the delicate balance between acknowledging history and fostering a constructive present. The revelations, conversations, and emotional labor of recent days had created both clarity and tension. I understood that the journey toward trust and understanding was ongoing, requiring patience, empathy, and resilience. Each conversation became a building block, reinforcing the foundation of our relationship while acknowledging the fragility inherent in any complex family dynamic. As the days passed, moments of genuine connection began to emerge. He started volunteering small acts of care, sharing a meal, offering to help with errands, asking thoughtful questions about my day. These gestures, though subtle, carried profound significance. They were not grandiose reconciliations but steady affirmations that the bond between us could withstand the strain of past misunderstandings. I found myself responding with gratitude, noticing that even minor acknowledgments of effort could reinforce trust and connection. However, progress was not linear. Occasionally, old tensions resurfaced, triggered by seemingly innocuous events. A misheard remark, a lingering glance, or a memory that had not yet fully healed. In these moments, I reminded myself that reconciliation is rarely smooth and requires flexibility, understanding, and a commitment to honest dialogue. Each challenge became an opportunity to practice patience, to listen without judgment, and to reaffirm the emotional foundation we were striving to strengthen. One afternoon, as we sat together in the garden, I shared a memory of his childhood that I had never mentioned before. The story was simple yet poignant, highlighting a moment when his empathy and intuition had surprised me as a parent. He listened intently, the tension in his posture easing slightly, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a genuine sense of mutual recognition. This exchange, simple as it seemed, reinforced that understanding often grows in small, intimate moments rather than grand gestures. I realized that these small interactions, conversations, shared memories, and acts of consideration were building a bridge between us. The journey was ongoing, filled with uncertainty and vulnerability, yet it carried the potential for lasting connection. The lesson became clear. Rebuilding trust requires consistency, honesty, and the courage to confront difficult emotions head-on. Only through these repeated efforts could a fragile reconciliation transform into a resilient bond. By the end of Part 9, I recognized that the emotional work we had undertaken was both delicate and rewarding. Each conversation, revelation, and gesture of care contributed to the slow restoration of trust, reminding me that family relationships are living entities, shaped by both our choices and our willingness to face discomfort with courage and empathy. The path forward was uncertain, but I felt a quiet determination to continue walking it alongside my son, embracing both challenges and moments of connection with equal intention. Even as I thought our relationship was slowly mending, an uneasy tension lingered beneath the surface, reminding me that reconciliation rarely moves in a straight line. That morning, I received a message from a distant relative, one who had attended the wedding. Their words were polite but carried a subtle insinuation, questioning the appropriateness of the events that had unfolded. I felt a familiar pang of discomfort, the reminder that other people's perceptions can sometimes exacerbate wounds we are already trying to heal. I considered whether to share the message with my son. On one hand, I wanted to maintain transparency. On the other, I feared stirring anxiety in a fragile space we were slowly rebuilding. Ultimately, I decided to show it to him, hoping it would open a discussion rather than provoke conflict. He glanced at the screen, eyes narrowing slightly, and I immediately noticed the flicker of old defensiveness. He did not speak at first, instead letting the words linger between us, a silent acknowledgement of the tensions that continued to hover despite our small victories. We began talking, carefully dissecting the message's implications. He admitted it made him feel judged and exposed, and I acknowledged that while we cannot control others' opinions, we can control our responses. Our discussion evolved into an exploration of boundaries, expectations, and the subtle pressures that arise in family networks. He expressed frustration at the idea that one misstep or, in his view, one moment of emotional hesitation could define the way others perceive him. Listening, I realized that his reluctance at the wedding had not been merely stubbornness or disrespect. It had been the product of cumulative insecurities and fears of judgment. Later, as we walked through a nearby park, the spring air carried a crisp freshness that contrasted sharply with the heaviness of our conversation. I asked him about his earliest memories of family expectations, wondering how long these pressures had been shaping his choices. His response was tentative, reflective, and at times interrupted by silence, as if digging into these recollections required careful negotiation with his own emotions. He described moments when he had felt sidelined or misunderstood, times when his gestures of care went unnoticed or were misinterpreted. I listened without interruption, allowing him space to voice what had long remained unspoken. By the time we returned home, I understood that the wedding incident was only a symptom of a deeper pattern of unaddressed emotion and miscommunication. The more he shared, the more I realized how fragile our interactions had been, built on assumptions and past hurts that neither of us had explicitly confronted. I began to see the layers of pain and vulnerability that influenced his actions, and I felt both empathy and sorrow. Sorrow for the moments lost and empathy for the human complexity that had led us to this point. That evening, I found myself reflecting on my own role in shaping these dynamics. I remembered times when I had imposed expectations without noticing their impact, moments when my desire for connection had inadvertently created pressure. A quiet admission of my own missteps allowed us to engage in a dialogue that was not about blame but about understanding. He responded in kind, acknowledging times when he could have expressed himself more openly, when fear or pride had prevented him from acting in ways that aligned with his true intentions. Days passed, and I noticed subtle shifts in his behavior. He seemed more deliberate in his interactions, more willing to express consideration without prompting. Yet, the underlying tension was never fully gone. At times, his gestures of kindness were shadowed by hesitation, a reminder that trust is built incrementally and that past disappointments leave lingering marks. I reminded myself that these small steps, though uneven, were essential milestones in the long process of emotional restoration. One afternoon, while sorting through old photographs, we stumbled across an image from his childhood, a moment captured when he had spontaneously embraced a family member in a gesture of comfort. We laughed softly at the memory, but the laughter carried more than amusement. It carried recognition of enduring affection beneath layers of misunderstanding. This moment became a subtle turning point, a reminder that connections formed in innocence can endure even the weight of years. As the week progressed, a family dinner brought additional challenges. Relatives, unaware of the careful dialogue unfolding between my son and me, made comments that tested our composure. He noticed, and I noticed the flicker of anxiety in his expression. We exchanged a brief, understanding glance, signaling our mutual commitment to maintaining calm and reframing the conversation. The night was a delicate balance of engagement and restraint, a test of the emotional strategies we were slowly refining together. By the weekend, I sensed that we were moving toward a more stable equilibrium, yet I also knew that true resolution had not been reached. Reconciliation is rarely a single moment. It is a series of conscious choices, repeated actions, and patient listening. We began planning small, intentional experiences together, shared walks, discussions over coffee, and quiet evenings of storytelling. Each interaction served as a reaffirmation of our commitment to understanding and connection. That evening, as I prepared a simple dinner, he joined me in the kitchen. The act itself was mundane, yet charged with significance. A shared task devoid of expectation, allowing conversation to flow naturally. He spoke of future hopes and ambitions, expressing a desire to redefine our relationship on terms that honored both of our perspectives. I responded with encouragement, emphasizing that growth requires both vulnerability and patience. For the first time, the emotional weight between us felt less like an obstacle and more like a shared journey, an evolving narrative shaped by dialogue and understanding. By the end of Part 10, I felt a cautious optimism. The wedding incident was no longer a singular point of conflict but part of a broader tapestry of emotions, decisions, and reconciliations. Each conversation, gesture, and shared experience contributed to a more nuanced understanding of each other. The path forward remained uncertain, yet we had begun to navigate it together, aware of the fragility of trust but committed to its ongoing restoration. The story of our relationship, once punctuated by betrayal and hesitation, was now being rewritten through small acts of honesty, empathy, and shared effort. The quiet rhythm of our renewed understanding was suddenly disrupted one afternoon when I received an unexpected call from my son. His voice, hesitant and measured, hinted at something weighing heavily on him. I could hear the tension in his words even before he spoke, and I braced myself for a revelation I had not anticipated. "We need to talk," he said, "about what happened at the wedding and what it meant for me." I felt a flutter of anxiety and curiosity. Could we face the raw truth without fracturing the fragile progress we had made? He arrived at my home a few hours later, and I noticed a subtle shift in his posture, the careful way he avoided eye contact at first. It reminded me of the boy he had once been, cautious, wary of judgment, yet carrying an undercurrent of unspoken emotions. I offered him a seat, and we sat in silence for a few moments, allowing the weight of unspoken words to settle around us. That pause was more significant than any opening sentence could have been, creating a space for honesty to emerge. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. He confessed that seeing the best man offer his arm had stirred emotions he could not easily explain. Shame, guilt, relief, and a complex mixture of resentment toward himself. He admitted that refusing to escort me had not been an act of malice but of fear of being exposed, of not living up to perceived expectations, and of confronting emotions he had long suppressed. Listening, I realized that the incident, which had initially felt like a personal betrayal, was a mirror reflecting the internal struggles he had carried silently for years. We delved into memories of his childhood, exploring moments that had shaped his perceptions of family duty, responsibility, and emotional expression. He described times when he had felt inadequate or overlooked, instances when his intentions had been misinterpreted, and occasions when my own responses had unintentionally reinforced his insecurities. I listened with patience, resisting the urge to defend or rationalize past actions. Our conversation became a shared excavation of history, uncovering layers of misunderstanding and emotional neglect that neither of us had fully acknowledged. As the discussion progressed, I asked him what he needed from me in order to heal. His answer was simple but profound: understanding, patience, and a willingness to let go of lingering resentment. He wanted reassurance that one moment, one lapse in judgment would not define our relationship or his place in the family. I offered him exactly that, acknowledging that while our emotions had been hurt, the foundation of our bond was strong enough to endure missteps and miscommunications. We moved on to discuss how we could prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. I suggested creating a system of open dialogue, small acts of transparency, and deliberate efforts to check in with each other's feelings before assumptions took root. He responded with a willingness I had not fully expected, demonstrating a level of emotional maturity that filled me with cautious hope. For the first time, our interaction felt less like negotiation and more like collaboration, a mutual effort to navigate complex emotions with intention and care. Later that evening, we decided to revisit the wedding video footage together. Watching the moments unfold, I noticed nuances I had overlooked before: the fleeting expressions of uncertainty, the subtle hesitations, and the micro-expressions that revealed layers of feeling beneath the surface. He laughed softly at some moments and winced at others, and we shared observations in a tone that was reflective, not accusatory. By analyzing the event together, we transformed a source of pain into a tool for understanding, using the past as a lens to illuminate patterns that had long gone unexamined. The following day, I saw a shift in his demeanor. He approached interactions with other family members more openly, more consciously aware of the emotional undercurrents that could complicate connections. I noticed a subtle confidence in his movements, a willingness to engage without pretense, and a growing comfort with vulnerability. It was a quiet evolution, not dramatic or theatrical, but deeply significant. The wedding incident no longer held the power to define him or our relationship. Instead, it had become a catalyst for self-reflection and growth. Yet even as progress unfolded, residual tension remained. I could sense the weight of unspoken judgments from relatives who had witnessed the event. I knew that external perceptions often amplified internal anxieties, and I reminded him and myself that the opinions of others did not have to dictate the quality of our connection. We practiced resilience in subtle ways, acknowledging our feelings, setting boundaries with extended family, and choosing moments of engagement thoughtfully rather than reactively. Each choice reinforced a commitment to emotional integrity and mutual respect. By the week's end, a small breakthrough occurred. He reached for my hand as we sat in the living room, an unspoken gesture of reconciliation and trust. It was simple, almost imperceptible, yet it carried more weight than words could express. I squeezed his hand in return, silently affirming that forgiveness, understanding, and connection were not abstract ideals, but living actions manifested in daily interactions. The power of this moment lay not in grand declarations, but in the authenticity of presence and acknowledgement. That night, as I reflected on the conversation, I realized that part 11 of our journey had been transformative. The wedding incident remained a pivotal reference point, yet it had evolved from a symbol of betrayal to a catalyst for honest dialogue and emotional growth. Our relationship was not perfect, nor was it free from tension, but the foundation had shifted. We had begun to co-author a narrative rooted in awareness, empathy, and deliberate effort. The road ahead would still hold challenges, yet I felt a renewed confidence in our capacity to navigate them together, guided by transparency and the shared desire to understand rather than judge. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the familiar patterns of my living room, yet I felt a heaviness that refused to lift. After the tentative breakthroughs of the past week, I had assumed that our conversations had cleared the air, that understanding would slowly settle like dust in the corners of our relationship. But an unexpected message from my son disrupted that fragile equilibrium. A short note suggesting we meet at a nearby park to talk things over properly. Something in the brevity of the message hinted at urgency, perhaps even unspoken guilt. I hesitated, heart pounding, wondering what emotions would surface when we faced the public neutrality of a park rather than the private confines of home. When I arrived, he was already waiting, standing near a bench under a sprawling oak tree. The late summer breeze stirred leaves around him, and the sight of his stance, slightly rigid, hands in pockets, revealed the tension he carried like an invisible weight. There was a vulnerability in his posture, a subtle invitation to approach without judgment, but also a challenge. He wanted me to see him as both accountable and still flawed. I approached slowly, careful not to assume anything, and we sat side by side on the weathered wooden bench. The quiet murmur of distant conversations and rustling leaves provided an oddly comforting backdrop, a reminder that life moved forward even amid our lingering conflict. He began cautiously, acknowledging the previous discussions we had shared at home. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, "about why I reacted the way I did at the wedding. I see now that it wasn't just about fear. It was about pride, and maybe selfishness too." I nodded silently, inviting him to continue, sensing that this was the moment when raw truth could either fracture us again or strengthen our bond. He looked down, fingers tracing invisible patterns in the wood of the bench, and then back at me with eyes that shimmered with an honesty I hadn't seen before. "I hurt you, and I don't want to make excuses, but I need you to understand that I was wrestling with things I didn't know how to control." As he spoke, I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief because he was finally verbalizing feelings he had bottled for years. Sorrow because I realized how deeply our misunderstandings had shaped his decisions. We talked at length about the dynamics of our family, the unspoken expectations, the moments of miscommunication, and the long history of assumptions that had guided his behavior. He shared memories I had forgotten, minor incidents that had accumulated over the years and contributed to the tension at the wedding. Each recollection painted a fuller picture of the man he had become and the struggles he had faced silently. The conversation shifted naturally toward my own emotions. I shared how his refusal to escort me had felt like a public repudiation, a moment of humiliation that left me questioning my role as a parent. I confessed my fears, my vulnerabilities, and the quiet anger that had simmered beneath the surface. I spoke about the expectations I had held for him, not as a way to criticize, but as an attempt to illuminate the layers of mutual misunderstanding. Listening, he nodded, sometimes quietly, sometimes with subtle gestures that conveyed comprehension and empathy. For the first time, our dialogue felt like a true exchange rather than a negotiation, each of us peeling back layers of defensiveness to reveal the authentic selves beneath. Midway through our conversation, a sudden shift occurred. A memory he had avoided surfaced, the argument with his sibling over seating arrangements at the wedding, a minor incident that had amplified his sense of inadequacy. He spoke about it openly, admitting that he had magnified the tension internally, creating a narrative that positioned him as cornered and defensive. I realized that the best man's intervention, which had initially seemed intrusive, had actually provided a stabilizing influence at a critical moment. This perspective reframed my understanding of the wedding, highlighting the subtle ways others had mediated our interactions without me fully recognizing it. We lingered on this insight, examining the interplay between intention and perception, and how small, overlooked actions can shape larger emotional outcomes. It was a delicate conversation, requiring careful navigation to avoid rekindling past grievances. I could feel the weight of years of miscommunication lifting slightly as we spoke, the tension transforming into something more tangible. Understanding, the kind that demands honesty and patience in equal measure. As the afternoon sun shifted in the sky, we addressed the lingering question of reconciliation. He asked how we could move forward without carrying the burden of past failures. I suggested a commitment to transparency and open expression, small daily acts of communication that could prevent the accumulation of unspoken resentment. He agreed, noting that he had previously relied on avoidance as a coping mechanism, and that breaking that pattern would require conscious effort. There was a quiet beauty in this shared acknowledgement, the recognition that progress demanded work from both of us, not just the forgiveness or adjustment of one party. Toward the end of our meeting, I sensed a subtle transformation. He reached out, lightly resting his hand on mine, a gesture that encapsulated apology, connection, and a tentative hope for the future. I responded with the same gesture, feeling the symbolic weight of our shared commitment to rebuild trust. The tension that had defined our interactions for months, perhaps years, felt momentarily suspended, replaced by a sense of alignment and mutual intention. It was not the resolution of all conflict, but a pivotal step toward it. Walking home later, I reflected on the layers of Part 12 in our story. The confrontation had been difficult yet necessary. It exposed vulnerabilities, unearthed long-suppressed emotions, and clarified intentions on both sides. The park, with its open yet private environment, had facilitated a dialogue that our home could not. It allowed the interplay of distance and proximity, the subtle observation of the world beyond our conversation, and the realization that reconciliation is both internal and relational. I felt a cautious optimism, tempered by the awareness that true understanding requires continual effort. By evening, I realized that the confrontation at the park was a turning point. It had reinforced the importance of acknowledging truth, expressing emotions honestly, and creating space for vulnerability. My son and I had begun to reweave the fragile threads of our relationship, slowly transforming them into something resilient, reflective, and anchored in mutual respect. The experience was a reminder that conflict, when faced openly, can be a conduit for growth rather than a source of permanent division. After the park meeting, I thought I understood the arc of our reconciliation. Yet there lingered a subtle, unspoken tension, a thread I hadn't fully grasped until that evening. I found myself sifting through old memories, the moments when my son had been distant, when I had felt overlooked or dismissed, and how each tiny fissure had accumulated over the years. Something in me knew that the resolution we were building could only hold if we confronted one final piece: the heart of the wedding betrayal, the moment when he refused to escort me down the aisle. It was a memory that had haunted me, simmering quietly beneath the surface, ready to resurface if left unaddressed. The following day, I suggested we sit down together again, this time at my home. The sunlight spilled into the living room differently than the previous day, softer, almost forgiving, yet the air felt heavy with anticipation. I noticed his hesitant movements as he entered, the way he avoided looking directly at the spot where we had argued before. I offered him a seat and poured 2 cups of tea, a small gesture to soften the weight of what I intended to discuss. We sipped in silence, each of us gathering courage, until I finally spoke, choosing words with care but without reservation. "I need to understand," I said gently, "why you couldn't walk with me that day. Not for appearances, not for anyone else, but for me. I need to hear it from you." My voice held a tremor, not of weakness, but of honesty, a signal that I was ready to hear whatever he had to say, no matter how uncomfortable. He looked down, tracing the rim of his cup, and I could see the conflict written across his features. There was shame, yes, but also a desire to explain, to bridge the emotional distance that had grown between us. He began slowly, recalling the pressure he had felt in that crowded hall. "I panicked," he admitted. "I saw everyone waiting, expecting me to act in a way I didn't know I could. I wanted to support you. I truly did. But the fear of failing, of embarrassing both of us, froze me in place." His confession was raw, unembellished, and I listened, absorbing the weight of years of unspoken guilt. The words themselves were not enough to erase the memory, but they offered context, a window into his internal struggle. As he continued, he revealed layers of emotions I hadn't anticipated. Anger at himself, disappointment in his inability to meet expectations, and an overwhelming sense of inadequacy had compounded into a decision he now deeply regretted. He admitted that he had felt trapped between his own pride and the image of the son I might want him to be. For years, he had carried this silent burden, reshaping his narrative to justify his actions internally while avoiding confrontation. The honesty in his voice, paired with the vulnerability in his posture, created a fragile bridge between us, one that required careful navigation to prevent collapse. I responded with quiet reflection, acknowledging the complexity of his feelings while also asserting the impact of his choice. I spoke of my own hurt, not to accuse, but to share the depth of the disappointment and loneliness I had felt walking down the aisle without him. "It wasn't just a matter of etiquette," I explained, "or of pride. It was a moment I imagined sharing with you, a marker of our connection, and for a brief time, it felt like that connection was broken." My words were measured, intended to express emotional truth without inflaming old wounds. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, and there was a pause, a suspended moment where silence held both tension and potential. Then he asked a question that surprised me. "Do you think it's possible to forgive fully? To not just acknowledge my apology, but to trust me again in moments like that?" The question hung in the air, challenging me to consider the meaning of forgiveness and the work required to rebuild trust. It wasn't simply about words. It was about a willingness to engage, to act differently, and to understand each other more deeply. I answered honestly, sharing that forgiveness was a process, not a destination. "I want to trust you," I said, "but trust has to be rebuilt slowly, moment by moment, through actions that align with intention." We discussed what those actions could look like, small gestures of reliability, openness, and mutual respect that could gradually restore the bond weakened by the wedding incident. The conversation was painstakingly slow, but each word, each acknowledgement, layered a foundation for renewed trust. As the afternoon waned, we ventured further into reflection, exploring the interplay between fear and love, pride and humility. He admitted that much of his avoidance stemmed from fear of failing me, yet he now recognized that avoidance itself had caused the most pain. I shared the realization that even my own pride had sometimes prevented me from fully understanding his perspective. In that moment, we were equals in our vulnerability, both willing to confront discomfort in pursuit of something larger than our past grievances. We paused again, allowing the weight of the dialogue to settle. It was not dramatic. There were no loud arguments or cathartic outbursts. Instead, it was quiet, deliberate, and profoundly human. I saw in him a determination to change, a readiness to act differently in future circumstances, and I felt a corresponding resolve within myself to meet him with patience and empathy. The memory of the wedding, once a source of tension and sorrow, began to transform into a lesson. A reminder that mistakes can be catalysts for growth when faced with honesty and accountability. Finally, toward evening, we stood together at the living room window, watching the fading light reflect on familiar rooftops. He turned to me, a hesitant but sincere smile touching his features. "I know it won't erase that day," he said, "but I want to be there for you, in every way I can moving forward." I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. The confrontation that had loomed as a potential source of renewed conflict had instead become a turning point, a place where honesty, humility, and shared intention could coexist. As he left, I felt a profound sense of closure for part 13 in our story. The dialogue had clarified intentions, revealed vulnerabilities, and laid the groundwork for a future less burdened by past misunderstandings. While not every conflict was resolved, the emotional distance had narrowed, and a pathway to continued reconciliation had emerged. I reflected on the subtle beauty of this moment, the awareness that growth often comes not from grand gestures, but from patient, deliberate engagement with truth and emotion. The morning after our long conversation at home, I woke with a strange mix of anticipation and nervous calm. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as though the weight of the previous days had begun to lift. I brewed my tea slowly, watching the steam curl upward, and thought about how delicate the process of rebuilding trust could be. The memory of my son refusing to escort me down the aisle was still there, sharp in its sting, but it no longer felt like an unmovable barrier. Instead, it seemed like a marker, a reminder of both vulnerability and the potential for change. I wondered if he too felt the same cautious optimism I did, if the conversation had planted seeds that would grow into genuine understanding. Later that afternoon, I received a message from him, suggesting we meet again. He wanted to go through old photo albums, to talk through moments from my life and his, to create a bridge between the past and the present. When I arrived at the small cafe we had chosen, he was already seated, hands clasped, eyes flicking up only occasionally to meet mine. There was a quiet nervousness about him, a reflection of the internal weight he had been carrying for years. I greeted him with a tentative smile, and we ordered our drinks, the clinking of cups punctuating the silence as we settled into what I sensed would be another revealing conversation. He started with stories from my youth that he had never heard in detail, recalling anecdotes I had shared with his younger self but which had somehow faded over time. Listening to him recount them with curiosity and care, I felt a shift, a recognition that he was actively seeking to understand me, not just as a mother, but as a person with her own history, strengths, and vulnerabilities. I told him about moments of fear, triumph, and quiet sorrow, and for the first time he responded with empathy rather than judgment. The simple act of being heard without defensiveness brought an unexpected warmth to our interaction. Eventually, the conversation turned to my wedding day. I could feel the old ache begin to resurface, a reminder of the humiliation and disappointment I had carried. Yet, unlike before, I found the words flowing naturally, unfiltered but not hostile. "I won't pretend it didn't hurt," I said softly. "Seeing the best man offer his arm while you turned away, it felt like a fracture in something I thought was solid." I studied his face, searching for a reaction, and saw a mixture of guilt, shame, and determination to make amends. He didn't offer excuses, not at first. Instead, he admitted the fear and inadequacy that had dominated his decisions that day. He spoke of feeling trapped between what he thought I expected of him and his own insecurities, and how that fear had paralyzed him in the worst possible moment. Each confession was like a brushstroke on a canvas, painting a more complete picture of the inner struggle I had only glimpsed before. I listened, realizing that understanding his perspective didn't erase my hurt, but it made the emotional terrain navigable for the first time. After a while, he shifted the conversation, asking questions about moments we had shared in recent months, seeking reassurance that our relationship could move forward. I appreciated his curiosity, the active effort to understand not just the past but how it had shaped us both. We laughed over shared memories, acknowledged mistakes without blame, and found small victories in our honest exchanges. Each moment of connection felt like a fragile yet growing bridge between two hearts that had once felt miles apart. At one point, he reached for my hand across the table. I hesitated, aware of the symbolic weight of the gesture. It wasn't just about physical touch. It was about a willingness to be present, to commit to rebuilding what had been fractured. When I finally placed my hand in his, I felt a pulse of relief and cautious hope, a subtle reminder that reconciliation was a process built on small, deliberate acts of trust. As the afternoon wore on, we explored topics beyond the wedding and past grievances, hopes, fears, and the vision of a future where we could navigate challenges without fear of abandonment or resentment. He expressed a desire to be more present, to act as a son who could offer support and companionship, not out of obligation, but from a place of genuine love. I shared my own desire for a relationship grounded in honesty, mutual respect, and empathy, free from the weight of unspoken expectations. Toward the end of our meeting, we stepped outside, the sun beginning its slow descent. He turned to me, a tentative but sincere expression on his face, and said, "I know I can't change that day, but I want to be here for you in every moment moving forward. I hope that's enough to start again." I nodded, feeling the tension of past hurt begin to loosen. The acknowledgement of failure paired with an earnest commitment to growth created a foundation upon which trust could be rebuilt. It wasn't an instantaneous resolution, but it was a step toward a more authentic bond. Driving home, I reflected on the lessons embedded in our shared history. The pain of the wedding day, once a source of shame and anger, had evolved into a catalyst for understanding, empathy, and intentional connection. I realized that the path to reconciliation was never about erasing mistakes, but about engaging with them honestly, learning from them, and choosing to move forward with awareness. The weight of unspoken words, the tension of unresolved conflict, and the fragility of trust, all had been met with deliberate conversation, creating a new narrative in which both of us could participate consciously. That evening, I sat quietly with a cup of tea, the sun casting a warm glow through the kitchen window. I allowed myself to feel the relief, the cautious optimism, and the recognition that healing was ongoing. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic reconciliations, just the subtle, profound shift that comes from understanding, honesty, and the willingness to meet each other halfway. In that quiet space, I understood that the true work of family, of love, and of connection often takes place in the small, deliberate moments when we choose to listen, speak honestly, and act with empathy. The week after our cafe conversation, I found myself replaying every detail in my mind, turning moments over as if examining the facets of a fragile gem. Each glance, every word exchanged with my son, felt like an effort to understand not just him but myself, my reactions, my expectations, and the layers of disappointment I had carried for years. It was strange to feel a cautious sense of relief alongside lingering unease. I knew reconciliation was a process, not an instant event. Yet, in those reflective hours, I began to appreciate the subtle changes in him. The softness in his voice, the way he paused before speaking, as if carefully weighing his words to avoid repeating past mistakes. That evening, we decided to take a walk through the park near my home. The weather was mild, with a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves overhead. Walking side by side, we didn't start with apologies or grand declarations, but with small observations about the colors of autumn, the laughter of children playing, the scent of damp earth. There was a tentative rhythm to our conversation, punctuated by moments of silence that no longer felt awkward, but comfortable. Each pause allowed space for reflection, for acknowledging the distance that had once separated us, and for appreciating the possibility of moving closer. Eventually, the talk returned to the wedding day. I admitted that the hurt lingered more than I had realized, that it was not just a matter of a single moment, but the accumulation of years of unspoken tension, unmet expectations, and unexpressed needs. He listened without interruption, his eyes fixed on mine, conveying a depth of attention that had been absent in the past. Then he began to share memories of his own perspective, how he had been influenced by fear, pride, and a desire to assert independence in ways that ultimately pushed us apart. His words were not excuses. They were a careful unpacking of his experiences and choices, and I felt a surprising empathy for his inner struggle. As we continued walking, we shared stories from our childhood and recent years, tracing patterns of misunderstanding and communication gaps. It became clear that many of our conflicts had been fueled by assumptions, expectations left unspoken, and a lack of willingness to bridge emotional gaps until it became necessary. This realization brought both discomfort and clarity. I saw how my own reactions, though rooted in love, had sometimes amplified his withdrawal, and he saw how his silence had deepened my sense of isolation. Acknowledging these truths together created a space for healing that neither of us had anticipated before. At one point, we sat on a bench overlooking the small pond. Ducks drifted lazily across the water, and I found myself reflecting on the symbolic nature of our reconciliation. Like the pond's calm surface, our relationship could reflect clarity if approached gently and with patience. He turned to me, hesitated, and said, "I want to make this right, not just today, but in how I show up for you in the future." I felt a lump in my throat, not from anger or frustration, but from the recognition that his words were sincere and intentional. We discussed practical steps, regular meetings, more open communication, acknowledging small gestures of care, ways to actively nurture our renewed connection. It was refreshing to approach reconciliation not as a one-time dramatic event, but as an ongoing commitment to presence, understanding, and mutual respect. Each idea, each plan, felt like laying a foundation, brick by brick, for a relationship that could survive future challenges with honesty and compassion rather than resentment and avoidance. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, we fell into a quiet, contemplative silence. There was no need for immediate declarations of love or forgiveness. The very act of being together, walking side by side, and talking openly had already begun to heal wounds that had seemed permanent. I realized that reconciliation is not a single gesture, but a collection of small, deliberate actions, a continuous practice of empathy, patience, and understanding. Later that night, I sat in my living room, writing notes about the day's conversation. I wanted to capture the nuances, the shifts in emotion, and the subtleties of his words so that I could reflect on them in the weeks to come. Writing became a method of grounding myself in the reality of the change I had witnessed, a reminder that both of us were capable of growth and conscious effort. I acknowledged the lingering scars without allowing them to dominate my perspective, understanding that past pain can coexist with hope for the future. The following days were filled with continued small interactions, a phone call to check in, a shared lunch, a casual text to share a memory or joke. Each moment reinforced the fragile yet real progress we had made. I began to notice how my heart felt lighter, how anticipation replaced anxiety when thinking about future interactions. It was not that all the pain had vanished, but that it had been reframed through the lens of understanding and shared commitment. One evening, while preparing dinner, I reflected on how the best man's gesture on my wedding day had unknowingly foreshadowed the possibility of kindness and support coming from unexpected places. My son's initial refusal had caused heartbreak, but the path toward reconciliation revealed that relationships are rarely linear. They twist, turn, and sometimes require intervention from outside forces to guide them back toward balance. It was a humbling lesson in patience, resilience, and the importance of seizing opportunities for healing when they arise. By the end of the week, our conversations had become more fluid, less burdened by the weight of old grievances. I noticed subtle changes in my own responses, a willingness to listen without immediately reacting, a capacity to appreciate intention over perfection. I could see that he was also practicing these shifts, and together we were forging a new dynamic that felt authentic and promising. There was still work to be done, of course. Trust is built over time, and both of us understood that. but for the first time in years I felt a sense of equilibrium returning. Reflecting on the journey so far, I realized that family relationships are complex, shaped by layers of expectation, fear, and past experience. The ability to confront difficult moments, to engage honestly with one another, and to commit to mutual growth transforms conflict into an opportunity for connection. The memory of walking down the aisle alone had once seemed like an insurmountable wound, but through deliberate effort, open communication, and shared vulnerability, we were rewriting that narrative together. The morning of my birthday arrived quietly, without fanfare, but with a sense of anticipation that felt more profound than any celebration I could have imagined. I had invited a few close family members over, unsure how my son would engage. After all, the past weeks had been a slow dance of rebuilding trust, mending old wounds, and testing the fragile threads that bound us. As I opened the door to greet him, I noticed the subtle changes. The careful way he smiled, the light in his eyes that had been shadowed for years, and the hesitance transformed into a kind of presence that felt genuine and intentional. We spent the morning together preparing simple meals for our small gathering. He was attentive without being overbearing, asking questions about recipes, sharing small stories about work, and even teasing me gently in ways that felt familiar and comforting. It struck me how healing is often not marked by grand gestures but by the small, consistent acts of attention and care. Each laugh, each exchange, was a stitch in the fabric of the relationship we were mending. And though the memory of walking down the aisle alone still lingered like a faded photograph in the back of my mind, it no longer held the power to define my emotions or our bond. When guests began to arrive, I noticed him take a subtle step back, letting me host while also standing by in support. It was as if he understood the balance between honoring my space and being present without intrusion. Later, as we all gathered around the table, he offered a toast. Not rehearsed, not formal, but heartfelt. He acknowledged the journey we had traveled, the mistakes made, and the lessons learned. There was no defensiveness, no excuses, just a clear, honest acknowledgement of his intentions moving forward. The room responded with warmth, and for a moment, I felt the weight of years lift slightly from my shoulders. After the gathering, we took a walk outside, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. I reflected on the significance of our progress, on how fragile relationships can be and how powerful the choice to repair them is. I told him how much his gesture on my wedding day had impacted me, the unexpected offer of kindness that had stood in for the absence of his own support. He nodded, and I sensed that he understood in a deeper way that some actions, even if delayed, can ripple through time to alter perspectives, soften hearts, and restore dignity. We sat on a bench overlooking the small lake near my home, watching as the sunlight glimmered on the water's surface. I shared my fears, my lingering doubts, and my hope that this renewed connection would last. He listened attentively, offering no platitudes but confirming that he understood, that he valued our bond, and that he was committed to continuing this journey together. The honesty and vulnerability in that moment felt like a culmination of weeks of effort, an affirmation that reconciliation is not just about forgiving the past, but actively building a shared future. I thought about the many times I had felt isolated, abandoned by someone I loved deeply. Each of those moments had left a mark, shaping my expectations and coloring my interactions with caution. But now, with each step forward, the marks seemed less like scars and more like reminders of resilience. I realized that part of healing is accepting that relationships will always carry history, yet choosing to let intention and care define the present. My son's willingness to engage, to confront discomfort, and to participate in the difficult work of repair had transformed the landscape of our relationship in ways that felt both profound and sustainable. The afternoon moved into evening, and we sat together sharing stories from our childhood, laughing at forgotten misadventures and recalling tender moments that had long been overshadowed by tension. I noticed the subtle gestures, the way he brushed crumbs from the table, the casual placement of his hand near mine, the patient way he answered questions, that reflected thoughtfulness, attentiveness, and a commitment to presence. I understood that trust is rebuilt in fragments, in the collection of these small, deliberate choices, and that the process, though gradual, was deeply rewarding. As twilight fell, we lit candles on the table, a quiet acknowledgement of celebration and continuity. I looked at him and felt a surge of gratitude, not for a single act or moment, but for the consistent effort, the patience, and the willingness to engage despite past misunderstandings. It occurred to me that reconciliation is a shared act of courage. It requires honesty, reflection, and the determination to move beyond old patterns. The room, filled with soft light, laughter, and warmth, felt like the physical embodiment of that courage, a space where connection had been restored and dignity reaffirmed. Later, when he helped me clear the table, I asked him if he remembered the day of my wedding, the moment I had walked alone. He paused, then nodded, his eyes reflecting acknowledgement and regret. "I understand now," he said softly. "I see what that meant to you, and I want to make sure I show up differently in the future." I didn't need more than his words, the sincerity in his voice, and the openness in his presence. It was a quiet triumph, a reflection of the emotional labor that both of us had undertaken and the healing that had begun to take root. As the evening wound down, we sat together by the fireplace, sharing a quiet companionship that had once seemed impossible. I realized that the relationship we had feared might remain fractured had transformed into something more resilient, rooted not in perfection but in honesty, effort, and the willingness to confront discomfort. I felt a deep sense of relief, not from the absence of past pain, but from the ability to coexist with it while choosing to engage positively, constructively, and lovingly. Before I went to bed that night, I reflected on the journey as a whole, from the initial betrayal on my wedding day, through months of reflection, dialogue, and small acts of care, to this moment of quiet reconciliation. It became clear that the hardest part of mending family relationships is not the gestures or conversations themselves, but the patience, the humility, and the courage required to confront past hurt and envision a shared future. And yet, the reward, restored connection, mutual understanding, and the revival of trust, is profound and life-affirming. I felt a sense of closure, though not an absolute finality. Life would continue to test us, but now we were better equipped to navigate challenges with empathy, reflection, and care. I understood that the best man's gesture on my wedding day had symbolized more than kindness. It had foreshadowed the possibility of healing, of unexpected support, and of reconciliation that could emerge even in the wake of deep disappointment. I went to sleep that night with a heart lighter than it had been in years, confident that our relationship, once strained and fragile, was now grounded in intention, understanding, and love. Looking back, I realized that dignity isn't just about standing tall when everyone applauds. It's about keeping your own heart intact when the people closest to you falter. Walking down that aisle, feeling the weight of my son's refusal, I discovered something unexpected. Kindness and respect can come from the most unlikely places. The best man's quiet offer of his arm wasn't just a gesture. It was a reminder that love and support aren't always where we expect them, and that our worth isn't defined by the choices of others. Life has a way of testing patience, resilience, and the courage to accept moments of disappointment without letting them define us. Even in betrayal or absence, we can reclaim our strength and move forward with grace, knowing our dignity remains intact. And if you think moments of family tension can't take an unexpected turn, there's another story on this channel that will make you rethink who truly has your back when the stakes are highest. You won't want to miss how one quiet decision changed everything in ways no one anticipated, revealing the power of resilience and unexpected loyalty.